breaking experiences are experiences as such. And when you break one of these concepts, you go directly to that territory. Then stop thinking art as a production of objects and art as a way of creating a process. And then we would have to qualify or describe what we understand of a process. Let us stop thinking of an idea and a result. A process goes beyond, in which a process is in a path in which you have ideas and you have results. Then we go to politics, to arts, in which we think of the links between the persons working on this creation. And we have to stop thinking of arts as this privileged space in which there is the artist and then the public. For me, political arts is not that the one in which the main subject is politics, is the arts that questions the relation existing between the artist, the public, the technicians, and the politics lies in there. Politics is, and this is why I believe that arts has been isolated from his revolutionary nature. As an artist, you have permission to do whatever you want. You have to justify and you have to have a reason to do so. And when we become eccentric, you leave behind the possibility of changing the world, and that is the contradictory part of the arts. You have permission, but it's not good, because if you do not use that permission to express something that is important, then you lose your way of doing arts. And in politics, we have to stop thinking of art as an self-reference to other artists, and we have to start thinking arts as a domain in which we can speak of a lot of subjects, dealing with the possibilities of touching other cultures. And sadly, I don't have time to continue, but we can continue to speak of all of this.
Bueno, Glacy.
Well, Glacy?
Tiene traducción simultánea, ¿verdad? Camila. Hay traducción simultánea, no sé si quieran el aparato, ha de estar ahí afuera en la mesita. Si no, supongo que da para entender.
Sim. Bom dia. Começo pedindo desculpas por falar no idioma.
Good morning. I apologize because I'm going to speak in Portuguese, because I think that'll be the best way for me to organize my ideas if I'm able to speak in my mother tongue. I would like to thank the Marcos and Miguel for the invitation to join this interesting panel. Camila made all arrangements possible, and he spoke about the link between education and art, and I'm very interested in the opportunity of thinking about education in addition to art. You can focus, instead of focusing the discussion on art, I organized it, and my name, or the name of my presentation, is Art, Education and Redistribution.
Três posições que são.
There are three positions that I consider to be political and pedagogical as teaching art in Brazil. I have a background in social movements, but I have been acting in institutions that we could consider as traditional and conventional and hegemonic institutions, which today are marking the sense of what contemporary art is, what can be institutionalized, and what is the official narrative of contemporary art in Brazil, and my idea of thinking how to act and how to share with you ideas of how to act in a collective of cultural mediators and educators in Brazil to fight against the position of these hegemonic mainstream institutions that have a political dimension. And we need to rethink pedagogical policies to get a more radical thinking. Therefore, I think we should talk a bit about how the notion of cultural mediation in Brazil stems from a French source inspired in a movement of the 1960s in France, led by French artists, and that is a main topic of post-cultural and post-colonial conflicts with a social dimension. It is a notion of mediation that stems from multiple knowledges and other subjects, with migrants and individuals that had no home, homeless or marginal persons marginalized from society, which didn't have access to education or culture, and we wanted to democratize and redistribute cultural products for the access of the cultural product produced by a few. When dictatorships emerged, the first governmental cultural policies in Brazil were copied from a neoliberal perspective, and basically the cultural policy in Brazil with financing where there are no limits. We need public resources and funds for the creation of a border, and thus banks develop cultural programs. Biennials are sponsored by oil companies and other financial and industrial tycoons and multilaterals, and because they realized that it was convenient to provide access to people to art, particularly to contemporary art that are closer to the people, and it was necessary to translate for people those realities with bridging gaps and creating bridges to ensure that art could reach that people and that they were able to benefit from all those cultural products. In this context, Brazil has two perspectives of cultural mediation. One, in schools, having artistic institutions as learning sides. Publics don't have a cultural artistic project like Paulo Freire criticized deeply institutions that didn't teach what art was, and then we have the existentialist dimension, which considers cultural experiences that could help solve social problems. So we have museums to solve the problems of drugs, museums that address the issue of violence, museums that address gender violence, and from those perspectives, we think that audiences are considered thinkers and also producers of that culture. In the case of those social groups, those are individuals who are marginalized from society, like women, indigenous people, poor people, homosexuals, and in a very violent context, like in the case of Brazil. Therefore, in this context, we start thinking that it could be an education that goes beyond art, but can establish mediation processes to change those cultural and educational indicators, and also address the notion of the audience as a flawed individual and a group of subjects or individuals who are void of artistic projects and have no cultural thinking. Based on that, we have tried to reposition and understand the times we're living in and how we could think of a mediation process that is creative and it doesn't serve the purposes of distribution for a group of chosen individuals. And I wanted to share with you 3 positions that contrary to the idea of democratization of culture, which is the distribution among a few. I wanted to bring this idea of country, Brazil, that is not interested in cultural distribution, but in cultural democratization. The first position I wanted to share with you is I wanted to ask you a question that has to do with the idea of who can speak and who can produce knowledge in museums, biennials, and other contemporary art circuits and circles. This question is accompanied by a picture from a project that has to do with this book, which is called Knowledge and Memoirs, which was produced by the Council of Contemporary Art of Brazil, a museum that is very important from a city with vast experience in mining. That museum was built using the narrative that or oral narration which was the only cultural experiences. It was a city of miners and there was no other artistic expressions, and we can say that the town was saved with the creation of that museum 20 years ago. Recently, that museum, the education directors produced or promoted an exhibition and held an exhibition that celebrated the work of a Brazilian artist and intellectual, Mr. Nascimento, and he addressed the issue of quilombos as a way to rethink freedom, quilombos, and runaway slaves who lived in the quilombos. That was the topic, and it was interesting that this topic was addressed from an inclusive viewpoint. The opening of that museum also brought about a turning point in the history of the city. The city no longer was mining town, but is now the city that hosts that cultural institution. And movement of recognition of the territory where that institution was based emerged. It is a town that has 4 quilombos, and therefore production is diverse. How can you talk about quilombos without becoming a quilombista and better understanding the processes of creation of art in that city? Indigenous people from those quilombos or villages have different traditions and customs, and address decolonization not only from the theoretical point of view, but from a practical point of view. And we realized that this was a good platform to ensure recognition and tell stories that go beyond the traditional notion of contemporary art. And I can show you the book for you to see it, a book in which persons were invited to share their stories without the mediation of a historian, but people could approach members of those communities without receiving a remuneration, and they did not receive a salary as curators, but they produced this book where we talk about quilombismo as art. This is very interesting as it goes beyond a project, and it makes us speak about rethinking education and art, and to establish a dialogue with art praxis. And in the end, you can determine who can be acknowledged as the producer or creator of that knowledge, whether it is artists, curators, and how the audience also reacts to the information they receive is not an informal thing that has no value, but is an informal character to a production by an institution that could be creative and give rise to other institutions. The other topic I wanted to discuss with you is another guiding principle of my work, which is the production of content for institutions. People go to an exhibition and they see cultural products, no matter how much we talk about processes and sharing and shared processes. In Brazil, we underwent a coup d'etat in 2016 in our recent history, which toppled President Dilma Rousseff, and conservative forces took over power in our country. In addition to that, we then had elections, and President Bolsonaro was elected. That since the beginning of the coup d'etat, art underwent a process of criminalization, demonization, and artists were persecuted. President Temer, when they took power after the coup d'etat to President Dilma, decided to break ties with the Minister of Culture without any second thoughts, and cultural classes and artists were persecuted in our country. The first act of or action of President Bolsonaro was to remove several ministers from their position, including the Minister of Culture. we have the notion of art is an art that goes beyond society, that have an inclusive and modern relationship, that sees art as a language outside of culture. In Brazil, that differentiation between art and culture is very strong. And the second aspect is how we can appease the idea and establish the idea of art as a product and not as a result of a collective and social process. This led to developing a pedagogical perspective that there is no point in considering art as work and as a dimension that is part of institutional contents and how we consider art. And we cannot see it as something isolated from society, but as something that is deeply embedded in the ecology, in the different knowledges, in the ways of doing, and knowledges that have to be part of what we know as education. And education in arts, we have to think about workers and the work intercombined to reach the overall society. That's another thing I wanted to share with you as part of an agenda for mediation. Finally, I wanted to bring the third idea I wanted to share with you, which is that we should not be content with arts and education with something that is going to disseminate knowledge and contribute to learning new ways in which people address art. We should have an agenda for creation and education that are closely aligned and linked to culture and art as well, and also to art as a need of removing the monopoly of art away from artists, and it shouldn't be a product that we can offer to a small elite or a small group of people. So when we are mobilizing and creating new forms of education and creation, we have to create processes of educational and cultural and artistic links, and we have a division between education and art. There are workers and artists who deal with those currents and think that audiences are simply there to assimilate processes or ideas that were created by others. Our idea is that we can redistribute the possibilities of creation beyond artistic products and services of our neoliberal art. We should rethink those links between art and education, with audiences and artists as a productive relationship of a public dimension of art, and not of the simply the production of a commodity. We have to think about the distribution of the right to creation, which is linked to the idea of creating not only objects but ways of reading, interpreting, being, and relating and yourself with the world, and ensuring that the role of institutions is to create the public area of art and education, and that art and education should be exclusive to institutions. I wanted to propose these ideas of education mediated by a museum, by a history that is deeply marked, and this becomes an institution and not a mere commodity, to think more about people and on education as a platform to confirm or the public dimension of art as an attribute to create new subjectivities so we can rethink our societies. Thank you very much.
Marco.
Marco. Good morning. As we have a big audience on the cloud, We have also online participation by our dear friend and colleague Monica Mieva, who is a researcher from the university. She's here, but we recorded her video. For any technical problem, this was easier, but fortunately she's here with us, so you can ask her questions. She will be joining the Q&A session. She was born in Mexico back in 1980. She's a curator, a researcher, and professor of the Center of Aesthetic Research of the Autonomous University of Mexico since 2005. She develops projects focusing in exploring several dimensions of the transforming possibilities of crossing between contemporary art, critical theory, and pedagogy. She's a PhD in contemporary philosophy from the University of Barcelona, and she has taught art history, philosophy, and aesthetics in UAF, the Ibero-American University, and in 17 research institutes. She was a pedagogy curator in the University Museum of Contemporary Art in the 4th edition of the BBWA Vancomer Museum Carrillo Hill, and several other museums of contemporary art, where she created the Department of Educational Studies, and in the Peggy Guggenheim collection. She was part in the development of tools for cultural organizations in the 31st Biennial of Sao Paulo, and in the intensive curatorial course of the Independent Creators International in Manila. She's a founding member of the platform Art and Education, and regularly cooperates with art journals and publications. We greet Monica, and please show her video.
¿Grabamos?
Bueno, mi intervención tiene el título de Pedagogías Salvajes, la pregunta por el arte y la emancipación, y es una reflexión que tiene que ver como con una intersección entre pensar la emancipación, el arte y la educación, desde la educación en los museos, la historia del arte, y también como todas las contribuciones que ha habido, toda esta reflexión desde las prácticas artísticas, artistas pedagogos. Entonces, en ese cruce de perspectivas es donde se va a desarrollar esta narrativa de la historia del arte en México, y de cómo algunas de estas prácticas de artistas pedagogos en Latinoamérica y en México han tenido algunas incidencias en discusiones de las epistemologías del sur y de las epistemologías feministas también. Digamos, como la pregunta por la emancipación, en principio, me gustaría como trabajarla o pensarla con ustedes fuera como de pensar la emancipación dentro de dogmas, digamos, como más propagandísticos, y pensarlo más bien en su registro más como de pensar la libertad, la relación del arte, la educación y la libertad. La libertad, desde luego, artística, como expresión, como creación, como imaginación política. La libertad en un sentido también social y político, ¿no? De cómo pues, hay todo un linaje, digamos, de artistas pedagogos que sí tienen una militancia política o que trabajan desde un activismo también social y político, que se relacionan con movilizaciones sociales, con luchas políticas en distintos momentos de la historia. Y pensar también el lugar que ha tenido la educación también como una herramienta justamente de emancipación y una herramienta de lucha social y política.
And a tool of social and political struggle within and outside the confines of art. And consider education for emancipation.
Con la creación de conocimientos y desarrollo desde el campo artístico, porque hay una pregunta que lleva mucho tiempo también y que se han dado respuestas como desde diferentes perspectivas y desde diferentes prácticas artísticas, de si realmente hay una cierta epistemología específicamente del campo artístico que es un poco más abierta o flexible, o que tiene menos corsés que otras disciplinas. Y reitero que por eso también ha sido central pensar el papel y la función social del arte dentro de las epistemologías del sur y dentro de las epistemologías feministas que realmente han sido como las revoluciones políticas más profundas de la contemporaneidad. Entonces, esta idea de cómo desde las prácticas artísticas
From artistic practice, you can bring about epistemological processes, educational processes that are different and different pedagogies. From this opening and flexibility that I would like to elaborate on later with some ideas by Uruguayan artist Andres Camixer. What is freedom? And freedom as a question, emancipation also as a question that has to do with Hanare said as an open mind, a broad mind, the ability to put ourselves in the shoes of others and empathize. I think that a broad mind or open mind has to do with a necessary political exercise to imagine other possible words, and these feminist epistemologies and the epistemologists of the South, which have revolutionized all the areas of social and political life all over the world, also have to do with a different conscious of our place within the arts field. And in education is like taking a position, a similar position, to become as a bridge with other areas that are outside arts. You have to have a set of tools and strategies to use art as a tool. I think I'm advancing what I want to develop later with a narrative from art history, but I think that practices and case studies that I want to share with you have to do with a search of participation that can be political or artistic or citizens' participation, and the search for artistic practices that point to that, more horizontal practices of a dialogue that might not be possible in other disciplines of social sciences, and possibilities of learning other ways of being and sharing and enabling tools. We see art as an educational tool and as a source for emancipation. This was a preamble of questions that came to mind when I was trying to reflect about the link between art, education, and emancipation. And I would like now to refer to some artists, a line or lineage of pedagogue artists who have considered about emancipation and reinventing formal education and educational mediation in museums, in curating practices, and in what we can call modernity. Schools and pedagogical models were established and founding, which were cross-cutting or multidisciplinary, and we could draw some lessons, and perhaps we could go back and rethink what was happening in those models and schools founded by artists. Here, we see these schools and pedagogical models or counter pedagogical methodologies and counter methodologies created by artists allow us to perhaps see how these become, in addition of being educational exercises, are disobedient, epistemological disobedience acts. Because boundaries are not so clearly established as in social sciences or exact sciences. They oppose hegemony, racial organizations, patriarchal organizations, knowledge processes that follow market ideologies or cognitive capitalism. So this type of epistemic disobedience has been thought by Luis Camitza, this Uruguayan artist, who has talked about the link. He wrote a book in 2017, and he has a question that he tries to answer throughout his book, going all over the art, the history of art in Latin America. For example, he mentioned Simon Rodriguez, the pedagogy of Paulo de Freire, the Discolorized Society of Ivan Illich, and he talks about art and as pedagogy and pedagogy as art, and those questions have reached the conceptual or non-object art of the region. And this is closely linked to freedom. It's like we have the umbrella of Freire that protects us all. He's the one who came up with this hypothesis, and I like it very much. So I would like to begin mentioning some example of artists who have created schools that have become reference in this regard very quickly, because cases of the classical examples are very well known by most of you in the audience, but I want to then make a specific reference to Mexican art in the 1970s, which one asked about freedom and placed freedom in the center, in the work in universities, in the streets, and in the trade union movement, in the feminist movement, where everything had to do with thinking of art as a social transformation tool, and also as a liberation tool or emancipation tool. So following Kamik's narrative, we could talk about the School of the South in Uruguay, who under the workshop of Joaquin Torres Garcia broke the hierarchy between art, design, and craft, and often asked questions how you could work for artistic, aesthetic equality with the principles of pre-Hispanic art and contemporary art, because contemporary Latin American art is not a mere continuity of European art, but actually a continuity of pre-Hispanic art. And there's in Chile another example of free of charge schools that were open for all. In this experimental school of artistic education was where the Ramona Parra Artistic Brigade emerged, that paid tribute to a communist militant young woman who had been killed in the demonstration in Santiago, Chile in 1946. And this has close links with Mexico, particularly with Diego Rivera and Siqueiros, and I think this model is very well known, that was thought about artistic praxis as a space of freedom and a praxis and exercise of freedom, which was the School of Valparaiso, which started in 1952 and that somehow remains active. And I think it is very beautiful, and that we should revisit the history of the Valparaiso School, because that is where pedagogic was considered as a poetic act. They thought of teaching and pedagogic processes as a poetic art. And perhaps we could have a link between art, education, and pedagogy outside the confines and the boundaries and limits and restrictions of education, including dogma, and from the ideological point of view. So if you please show my presentation, my slides, I would like to share with you some pictures. You will see again the Valparaiso school, images, the School of the Southern Uruguay. And I now want to talk about these links in Mexico, these didactics of liberation by Francisco Reyes Palma, who is a Mexican researcher and curator. In 1981, he published a book which is called Social History of Artistic Creation in Mexico, which is a very beautiful book that includes facsimile photos and documents, in addition to education and art in the post-revolutionary project by Jose Vasconcelos. We have the history of the Fine Arts Museum, the outdoor art schools, this pre-revolutionary period in Mexico had to do the art was an instrument of social transformation, and we're talking about a recently created nation, and the research work by Palma talked about redistribution of artistic education, and not only as freedom. And then I think gradually there was disappointment with this, because the post-revolutionary rhetoric became institutionalized and new cultural policies emerged in Mexico with a profound social and political representation back in the 1950s, 1960s, and 1970s. And there was another emerging need contingency which demanded that artists thought of the relationship of art in educational contexts like university campuses and schools. And this was interesting because in museology we had the same problem with new museology. We all had the students' riots and revolts in Mexico. We can talk about the context of the dirty war, what we call the dirty war, when groups of artists who in the 1970s, and this was interesting, these groups were created after the students' movement of 1968. Several of those groups which emerged from workshops in art schools of universities and some of graphic production, and they were very critical not only of arts education, of the teaching methodologies of universities, and the scope of the work of artists not only as producers of commodity, but artists at the beginning of societies as a cultural worker. I think this was a major contribution of artists in the 1970s, which also is linked to the issue of freedom and emancipation. There's a book with visual artists of the 1970s that we should revisit to try and understand this part of the Mexican art history. There are several cases, but I will only mention a few. I think we can continue showing slides. No, please go back. There are artists like Gomez Morin, Carlos Arique, Carlos Salas, Hector Munoz, Victor Munoz, who were design professors in the Autonomous University of Xochimilco, Mexico, and searched and wanted to link the academy with social reality. The monumental graphic workshop emerged from this school, including Joaquín Conde, Yolanda Hernández, Carlos Seguera, Mauricio Gómez Marín, and it has this slogan that knowing is building, not reproducing, which I think is very interesting. And we think of art as an exercise of imagination, to imagine the political future. And they thought art history of Mexico, like the repoliticization of the memoir, social movements and popular movements in Mexico, and they held workshops not only in universities but also worked with children in Sinaloa in the summer of 1977 and 78. They also had children's workshops in Nicaragua at the request of the Ministry of Culture of Nicaragua, of the Government of Social Reconstruction of the Sandinista revolutionary government, and used these pedagogical processes as a political education, artistic education, and emancipation tool. And this work was sustained for many years in this neighborhood of the city of Mexico. This workshop of visual arts research work in Michoacan is still active, and they do remarkable work. And of course, this is perhaps a case that is more popular of alternative pedagogy, which is the workshop of art and ideology of ONAM, who also leads the course on live art. But there were others that also had an impact in formal and informal educational environments. In the group 65 in the U.S., and they were involved in university reforms, the construction of memorial in 1968, then with community work with Puerto Rican and Latino communities in the U.S., and then in Puebla you also had similar examples. In terms of epistemology, all these cases of groups in the history of Mexican art take us back to a question that I did in a different book. What and who do we have artistic education for? This is an article of 2014, and why we need to combine art in other areas of knowledge or political participation. What are the obstacles and the ancient structures that we should re-examine? Because teaching art in public schools should be justified as a way of supporting education in other disciplines like math and sciences, that it helps improve creative thinking. Art could reinvent education as a hypothesis and question to be answered, to decompress and release all these epistemologies that are from contemporary emergencies and contingencies. And then quoting Camille, he said, what politicians want art to do and what are their actual expectations, how art schools could perpetuate artificial divisions. I think that we are at a crossroads. We need to conceive artistic education to meet the demands of our market, of art, or should we think about artistic education considering the agenda of social organizations and emancipation programs? I am almost finishing my presentation. Several artists of other generations, including Jose Miguel González Casanova, who has led some educational projects, Monica Meyer, Carlos Falgueras, and Monica makes a distinction between feminist activism, artistic praxis, and education and pedagogic, and also Fernando Palma, the artist, and the civil society. I think the work of all these artists, I was also thinking about Gerda Gruber and Monica Castillo, who are artists who somehow or in one way or the other have a higher profile but were left outside the discussion of recent art history because their contributions had to do precisely with these methodologies and techniques applied in the field of education beyond simply creating objects and commodities. So these are artistic practices that leave a different kind of footprint rather than just an object or artistic work, but lead to questions that lead us to rethink art as a field for social transformation of community work and emancipation. How from art we could create wild or indisciplined methodologies or pedagogies. I think this was interesting with a network of art and economy, art and agroecology, art and education to exchange learning and relearning experiences. I think feminism was very instrumental in changing practices like Monica's projects of El Tendedero. We need to unlearn a patriarchal epistemology that is natural to us.
And also how to develop all the stories and the process of research of all those artists. Monica has spoken, and she has a whole essay on artistic education, on love education, with texts and projects that deal with this subject. And Pablo Guerra also registered, more curatorial register, and he has developed the notion of transpedagogical education in the Biennial of Mercosur and all the categories who are hybrids. And I believe in the work of Fernando Palma there is another approach that deals with generating strategies for art in community arts, in exercises of resistance, of the activism in the Mexico City, where we have the work of Fernando Palma, to contextualize and to locate all these research in a useful manner. And I was thinking on these relations following the invitation to participate on this event as a historian, and I believe in museology we can have another narrative and another and other resources dealing with other processes. Thank you very much for the invitation. Thank you, Monica Mieva. Please stay with us for a while to connect with the public during the debate. We had also the participation of Eloisa Buarque from Holland, but she apologizes because she's at the hospital. She has the hospital with pneumonia. She's not very ill. She's getting better, but she is at the hospital and she cannot participate with us this morning. Please, Marco. Good evening to all of you. It is a great honor for me to be here in Havana, to see very well-known faces and friends. Thank you, Jorge. Thank you, Camila. Thank you very much, Jose Miguel, and to share this table with my dear comrades here who have been reflecting on very important issues. I work on popular education, and I'm going to invite you. Before starting with my speech, please let us stand up, stretch out a little bit, and see the people that are around you. Please stretch out, ups and to the sides as well. Do some torsions. let us wake up a bit.
Porque si no nos vamos a...
Otherwise, we are going to get numbed. We are almost going to launch we are going to be with you for another 20 minutes. Then we are going to be doing some talking, and then we are going to lunch. I wrote 3 different things to bring them here. I'm not going to read them. I'm going to read just fragments of them from the communities to start the resistance community in the social movements. We ask to ourselves, arts for what and arts for who? Because any creator today has the privilege to see it and describe, to design and to create, and that privilege is not for everyone. 70% of the world population does not have that privilege. So we if we have time to think, we are privileged, and we have to be conscious of that privilege. On the other hand, in a world where there are so many contradictions and where we are witnessing a genocide, where we have a blockade, where there is injustice everywhere, death, poverty, what can we use? How can we use poetry? How can we use arts? How can we use a painting? How can we use a dance? I believe the answer is in the originary communities. It is good to construct hope, collective hope, collaborative hope. Is there in the creative collaboration, in the collective expressions of arts, that where we find hope to feed, where we find the space to dance a new rhythm, to speak around a fireplace. And that hope, for me, is very important to bring about some hope to this chaotic world. And Monica, this epistemological theme, how do we approach this world? How do we inhabit this world? And I was speaking to Daniel yesterday. It is not only an epistemological subject, it is an ontological subject. How do we perceive ourselves? How do we perceive these relations that we have with the world? Because we can speak of art when we speak of a ritual, of an offer, and of a work of art, because it is yes or no at a museum. It has a value, every expression. So I go back to my question today. How can we use poetry? How can we use art? How can we use education? We have to say that there is a tension, according to Antonio Gramsci, between hegemonical culture and alternate culture. And the hegemonical culture tends to steal the sense of the true expressions of the peoples and to turn them into merchandises. On Monday, we heard Grossvogel. He was saying not only the colonial, anti-capitalist and anti-patriarchal, we have to be anti-imperialist, we have to be anti-imperialist, anti-racist, anti-hegemonical. We know what we do not want in this world, and the art allows us to think of a world how we want it, how we do not want a patriarchy, we do not want colonialism, we want a fair world, in a world where there is no hunger, where violence is eradicated on all its forms. Violence is the exercise of power, as Daniel said, most of the time silent power upon populations, because art and education can be a good tool to domesticate. It can become chains, or they can be tools to emancipation. It all depends on how we approach it, from which perspective we approach it. It has a vision, an ethical vision, that allows us to create tools for critical and dialectical reflection, or we can offer knowledge to chain people. The alternatives in the art and education are the construction of those new possibilities. And Daniel said it in the workshop. Sometimes we do not know how the workshop is going to end, and the possibility of hearing of the group, there lies the possibility of creating new realities, on the possibility of creating that thing that facilitates the new classroom. And there is the freedom to create new things in classrooms when listening to the students and to give up power. What is poetry for? What is art and education for? Only to break those chains that enslaves us, to imagine new possibilities of new worlds, to hack the hegemonical culture, new possibilities, new ways of approaching the world. And for me, as our teacher Carlos Nunez said, it's a matter of ethics. We have to construct an ethical revolution, always being attentive to epistemological education. We have to be in constant surveillance of ourselves to see what we are producing, where are we reproducing those power patterns that we criticize so much. We have to stop being reproducers of this hegemonical power in our creational acts that we call art, on our educational acts who are the processes of learning and teaching. As I was saying, I believe it is not only the decolonial reality, is the intersectionality used against the empire or used by the empire to take off all the notions of gender and race. And we have to be aware of the capacity of the hegemonical culture to take away our concepts. What we do not want, it is a moment of speak of our dreams and to think of what we want to construct. We had words in the 70s, we had words in the 80s. Today we have to construct new words. Zapatismo in 94 created a lot of new concepts, but it's been 30 years of that movement. We have to work with the new context in which we live. That is harder than anything we've lived before. We have to overcome this climate crisis, the environmental crisis, the economic crisis, and a lot of authors are speaking of civilization crisis. When the fall of the Berlin Wall, some spoke of the end of the story, and then we had other movements and hope came to us again, and then hope was back. We have to start thinking of new national realities, how to integrate our countries. That dream of Che and Bolivar of Latin American integration is possible, but we are holding so hard our national identities that we cannot think of a higher reality. But I believe it's possible, because we have to construct education for emancipation. And emancipation is to have the rights that have been denied to us through history. We have to dream of freedom, a real freedom, but not an individual one, a collective freedom, the communality as an essential part of seeing the world. And that can be done through schools. We cannot construct individual freedoms because it takes us nowhere. The only thing that can lead us to a real transformation is the construction of new ways of relations, non-isolated from the world, but to communities.
Entonces voy a poder leer más.
What, for whom are art and education? Art and education are a privilege. The persons that have access to education in my country, in Mexico, are only a few. And those who have a free education, and when the places in which we have this kind of education are private schools, and they are very expensive. And this pedagogical for freedom of the peoples, it's a privilege for private education. Sometimes we use the methodologies of Paulo Freire to impose projects on dams and mining in our country, when there should be critical consciousness in this teaching process. And we see the reality that sometimes communities accept those shackles that are going to be imposed to them. Why? What do we use power for? We all have a little bit of power. At least now I have the power of being able to speak to you, to question myself, to quote a bunch of people. But for me, it's more important to question myself and to question all of you on this 15th biennial. What is art good for? What is education good for? What can we construct from those spaces to help transform this world in a better and fairer society as a critical part of our existence? Because there is a lot of people say, I create art, I create education, but I have nothing to do with politics. And the fact of having a political position is crucial in this time. You have to be conscious that if you don't have a political position, you are reproducing this colonial model. It's worse than having an oppressive position. And from communality, I was also asking myself on the first issue I wanted to present, how to qualify the ritual act of creating art. In 1988, I was walking in the sacred desert of Viricuta in the western part of our country with a friend of mine, and while we were walking, we were finding natural elements and we were doing offers, and we spoke of geoacupuncture. Many years afterwards, he's a painter, a sculptor, and he's pretty famous nowadays. And then he found out that there was an artistic current, and he has written even books about it. Was it an artistic expression, or was it an expression that we learned from the originary peoples of our countries? How can we call this expression the dance around the fire? It's an act of communion in which the community relates, where they reinvent, where myths are recreated. Let us not allow this sense, this magical sense, this collective and communitary sense of these acts to disappear. All the works that we do have to make sense. I loved what I saw this morning with the Colombian when talking to the birds. Unbelievable, excellent work, because we have to recreate what we do in the classrooms. We have to recreate museums. We have to fill them with true practical sense of community transformation.
Bueno, entonces puedo hablar más lento, pero es
I'm going fast. I'm going to try to speak slowly.
No, y es muy interesante porque
And this is very interesting because from Western art, we can listen to the drums or violins. And it would seem that it's not an artistic practice accepted or Eurocentric accepted, but when you comprehend the essence of that drum or that violin that goes to a rhythm that is played throughout the night, and that we are waiting for the sun to come up to be able to eat. This is an artistical practice. It is too big what happens at a community when we are doing this artistical practice. The collective arts is the community above the individual expression, which is also important, that allows the transformation of society. When we connect to those links, when we construct this link through social practice, how can we create works to create new links between society, to allow us to imagine new ways, because the hegemonic arts gives the realities as established realities that cannot be changed, but the reality is that the human can transform reality, and the Cuban people has shown through times that it is possible to be resilient, to change our realities. We have to remember that as well. We can change the world through artistic creation and through educations. And that will be all. Thank you very much.
Pues debo mencionar, ¿no?
I didn't say at the beginning, but I think it was clear that our goal with these two panels was to approach the art and education on an emancipatory perspective. And that is the main theme that we have tried to approach during this panel. Daniel said that it was very important to take out education from the educational institution and to work in collective ways, and to forget scholar normativity. He questions himself on disciplines and replaces them with ways of doing. He gives a special importance to art as a political action that questions the relations of powers between artists, publics, and cultural workers. Gleise tried to question the hegemonical arts as the institution in the world, but in particular in Brazil, and to consider mediation as an imposition that is going to educate, that is going to offer culture to the publics, as the critical Paulo Freire in bank education. And either we put them, either we make it serve the scholar or the assistential, but it continues to be financed by private companies. And from that perspective, she approached a series of strategies to break that reality. From the art institution, how to break the structures, the hegemonic structures that impose us a series of contents, and to recreate new contents with the participation of students and public. Monica Mieva did an epistemology of the Latin American region in the construction of relations between art and education, with very particular examples of different artists of the Mexican school and their relation with the state, with more contemporary ways. And on that framework she presents as an emancipatory discourse in which thinking and doing arts is a privilege, but it should be a right. And I believe it's a right, but it has become a privilege. And then there is the reaffirmation of the expression of hope, the construction of your wishes, your imagination of a better world, as it invites us to have an ethical revolution in order to create new contexts. So we do agree with all the ideas presented here. I don't know if you want to make a brief comment on 2 or 3 minutes. I believe it would be very positive if each one of you could speak of your interaction with the table, and then we go to the exchange with the audience. Please. Yes, it's been very provocative, everything that we have been listening here. I have 4 ideas that I wanted to expose. Art is not good because we have racist, imperialist, and macho art, and we think that because it is art, it's good, and it has nothing to do with reality. And Mark spoke about it. What I'm interested about art is to hack art itself. The art has permissions. The thing is that we have permissions that, based on eccentricity, it's hard to see those permissions become direct actions to change reality. But you can do things, and if you don't speak of art when you are doing that, then you can go crazy, because art sometimes can open doors for you, but it can also close some of them. A dear friend of mine, Rita Ponce de Leon, said that art is good to have time, and for me it's the most powerful idea I've ever heard of what art is. Everything takes away time from you. In this world, time, since Marx, time has been the greatest of commodities, and arts, to have time, takes you necessarily to have to qualify what are you using your time when you are interacting with arts. And the idea of art mainstream of your work, it's a very interesting idea, I think. And at last, I would like to speak of the pattern of oppressions that we are dealing with all the time. It's good to think of institutionality, but it's good to use it, but we can fall into essentialism. And as we have all said, it becomes the imperialist mechanism is to transform into identity what we have identified as our fights. And then the left wings, they want to fulfill their identity and they don't want to change the world. And we have to fight essentialism, because if you start thinking on the oppression patterns that we are dealing with, in which time can we go from a symbolic space to another one to be able to observe all the violence that we are subjected to? That can be a very good exercise. Sorry, I brought these notes of my speech. I'm going to leave them here. If you want to read them afterwards, I can leave them here.
Bom, também pensando.
I I am glad that you give me this opportunity to make some comments. It makes a lot of meaning when you talked about the need of reinventing and creating new words. That's the importance of art. I agree with you, we do need a new language, a new practices that lead not only to cultural or artistic objects. The possible path for a debate of collective emancipation is that art should have less importance, and when people talk about time and art of work, when it is artists describes themselves and artists begin to communicate themselves, and for me there's nothing emancipatory in that relationship, because class position and power over people who think and produce is very well established. And perhaps what's necessary is to understand that what we call art in the context in which people live in needs a different name. Yes, we need to rethink those terms. And another thing, when I was listening to my colleagues speaking, is that don't want to release that notion of emancipation depending on the school of Gramsci or Paulo Freire. Thinking in Brazil, it is very difficult to say that we don't want a fascist world, a neoliberal world, in the context in which persons are vindicating that world. So how can we create cultural mediation in the context in which cultural wars are besieging us, and the context in which we are? And I'm not only thinking about Brazil. We could extend this discourse to the rest of Latin America, because we talk about collective projects. Those collective projects are not always emancipatory, and we have to consider them from an emancipatory perspective, because we're living under fascist pressure. That is becoming increasingly evident, and we have to think about art as an instrument, and we have to think how art could become and contribute to social transformation when the society is leaning towards fascism, and our societies run the risk of falling to fascism. We need new symbols, we need new meanings to reach this notion of emancipation, so that it becomes effective in our discussions and in the collectives where our community art is created. I think that these discussions are a major challenge for all of us who have to rethink education for social transformation. We have to come up with new ways of doing. We have to come up with new words. And we should not be left in the utopian context.
dijeron, para que ver con lo que decía Marco de la distancia epistemológica, como de estas preguntas de qué sirve el arte, piensa culturalmente, lo que decía como de cómo se ve el poder, como aprovechar esa particularidad de este ejercicio cultural. También me pareció como muy lindo pensar esta idea de que lo político y la emancipación en realidad esos temas son ejercicios, también recupero de lo que dijo él. Y algo que creo que tienen en común las tres intervenciones de Gleisi, Daniel y Marco, tiene que ver con la idea del derecho a la creación, a la creatividad y a la libertad colectiva. Creo que esa perspectiva de derechos también es como, para mí, como pues, una pregunta que me gusta como transitar con creatividad, y más ahora que termino y creo que también otra idea que me pareció como, no sé, como que me gustó mucho y como muy, me pareció muy inspiradora, es la idea de la emancipación como camino a la esperanza colectiva, ¿no? Que eso creo que fue como que se marcó. Y cómo pensar también, fuera solamente de ese marco de epistemología, hacia una capa mucho más profunda también de lo que puede ser una experiencia del arte, en ese sentido, que realmente pues responda a las urgencias de los contingentes del presente. En fin, para mí fueron enriquecedoras todas las intervenciones.
Muchas gracias, Mónica. Marco.
Thank you, Monica. Marco? I will read something else. Foreign gods tell us about the sin of guilt and what cannot be done. As hijacked existences that make the Rastas and the Mexica and sustainability a superficial and fleeting fashion that is harmless as a drop in the ocean is an achievement. Ignore the possibility of friendship, the smile of a child, or the existence of a flower when the magic of life is in small things, and that is what makes life worth living. These are inconsistent concepts of growth and development based in the exploitation of human beings and the plundering of territories, but beware and strong consequences await those who oppose, because there are stronger forms of oppression. Thank you. Well, now we hand over the mic to the members in the audience who wish to make any questions or answers.
Compañero.
Good morning. First of all, I want to thank you for this wonderful talks. I think what you have mentioned is very interesting. I have a concern. In one of his works, he talks about that dealing with things is first part of education, and dealing with people who have the things is the second part. You were commenting about the idea or the topic of this panel about education, etc., and emancipation. With emancipation for what and from which perspective? You go from one biennial to another, from one art fair to another, and you find the same discourses. And today, counter-hegemonic discourses, anti-patriarchal and decolonial. But it's rare to see that regarding things you mentioned about the struggles against emancipation are becoming a discussion on the identity more than about transformation, and they end up becoming mainstream narratives. When you analyze, for example, the education processes, the different projects, the pedagogical platforms, there are many of them in Latin America, and you see who are behind these projects, no matter how small. They could be NGOs, foundations, governmental grants from Europe, United States. many a time those same projects and platforms that are being construed or developed to comply with the work that should be done in the communities end up reproducing those same narratives that belong to a rationale that is a little bit updated, that is making us discuss among ourselves about the fact that if we have to use an inclusive language, or if the problem is the market relationship and and art and everything related to community. I think we have to analyze deeper problems in the structures. It would seem that artistic praxis, pedagogical praxis, even the work of a museum are associated to structural problems that are very much there. Problems in schools, in university. I'm a university professor in Colombia, in the School of Art in Los Andes University, and this type of discussion doesn't take place. How we build links from within or among other spaces. This structural rationale that is a monster that seems to have a correlation in terms of art and education with those other territories. So when you see that many of these processes that are in a sort of way trying to deal with emancipation and are institutions that are a remnant of modernity and of the Western tradition. Even the concept of biennial is a Western concept. So we would have to wonder, what are we emancipated from? So I would like to know your perspective or your views on this. Thank you for the question. Well, I can begin. I think emancipation has different dimensions and different territories. We work on defending the territory in different communities. Some are communities that are very proactive, others are somehow resist this type of work. We work on community energy, collection of water. There is a comrade called Gustavo Castro who talks about the 5 autonomies: health autonomy, educational autonomy, energy autonomy, food autonomy, and water autonomy. With this, we could start also with cultural autonomy, legal autonomy, etc., etc., etc. But in my view, I was talking with a Colombian colleague. I was saying we need to build these resilient cells within the communities, in the autochthonous communities or indigenous community, and neighboring communities are also starting to build these spaces. And even in urban spaces, we have to use the original community values. We have to build new values for urban communities, for people of different races. We were also talking about in Chiapa that sometimes it's not a problem of demanding rights, but exercising rights. How do we develop emancipation or work emancipation in different communities? I think in terms of liberation of the people, this is the important thing is to have the relation between communities and the national states and among themselves also.
Hay una frase terrible de los...
There's a terrible phrase that says that there is no gesture, radical gestures that could not be dominated by the prevailing culture. We see that this becomes a pop culture element. We know. So we have to rethink the way in which we generate these radical gestures. And I also want to say something about this. NGOs are the ones that are supporting these emancipating initiatives, and when you follow the money, you find out this is what is happening in Mexico, the decolonization of the indigenous population. We know that the religion was to blame for their colonization and for the destruction of all these traditions. But in Mexico, with the idea of a nation, and then with the Mexican Revolution in 1910, there was a civilizatory discourse, and it was a school who colonized many communities in the 20th century. And in the 21st century, we see that art projects are the ones that are colonizing many communities. So we have to be aware of the fact that they are using us, because art is kindly, it allows us to do a work that otherwise would be very difficult to carry out. This is a very wide discussion. Not all dances, not all paints are art. There could be, without there are dances, paints, and other disciplines that are not art, but when you want to give them an value as an artwork, you are contributing to colonization. Obviously, we don't have to be paranoid. There are many things being done at the same time that we have to select. We are not infinite individuals. You have to decide in which you are going to participate. But still, we have to check all of them. I think your question is very interesting. And I think your approach is very interesting when you are talking about a mainstream production that reproduces all domination aspects that we are addressing here. In Brazil, we have a movement called the indigenous contemporary art, where they have a notion of what is the role of institutions in building institutions and having agreements between institutions for maintaining life in terms of genocides, in terms of losing rights or territories. It's not trivial to demand the possibility of having these agreements under an emancipatory approach wherever these movements are subjugated. I think we have two interesting examples. Why should we have a book on the quilombistas, for example, and there is an official story where we have the leaders that are aging and dying, and that process of perpetuating stories for a young generation that don't want to live in the quilombo and wants to move somewhere else, that book is a historical inscription and becomes a project to maintain those lands. So there are legal consequences in the struggle or in the fight with the state and the conservative forces that are trying to deprive those communities from their territorial land, be it a right-wing government or a so-called left-wing government. we are talking about the mainstream, but we have to take into consideration the social movements that have been part of the history of our country. We need to establish a dialogue with those communities. Another example is Tupinambak, which is a movement of leaders in Brazil for a museum. They talk about repatriation of persons who came from Denmark to Brazil. It's a return to the roots. It's a symbolic and cultural gesture, but it's a population that is defending the right to exist in a territory in Brazil that is a material and cultural proof that that population has existed for many years. We're talking about a state that wants to take away those territories and want to subjugate those social movements through negotiation platforms with strategies to fight for keeping their territories and their way of life, which sometimes can mean the implementation of those projects. And I think we need a new vocabulary. We need a new form of doing for a new notion of emancipation, which is not direct confrontation, which is not a political strategy, but a new way of fighting against neoliberalism with new weapons, with a complex dialogue in the wake of a state of a status where reality is not very visible and there is a lot of opacity. Yes, well, thank you.
Pues yo, como ya dijeron,
We got to hear the speaker because the connection is terrible.
creo que a mí he trabajado un poco más como con proyectos de arte como educación. Creo que justamente es un tipo como de práctica artística que sí, a veces sí sucede como fuera de estos circuitos mainstream de alta visibilidad, que no circulan en el mercado, mercancías, que son más experiencias colectivas, justamente aprendizaje lo más libre posible, a veces justamente de autonomía, que no tengan visibilidad, pues sí tienen una dimensión política potente. Creo que para responder a esa pregunta depende mucho de los contextos en los que estemos. Tal vez un posible como, no sé, como farol o dirección puede ser pensar en qué urgencias políticas y sociales hay como en cada contexto, en cada tiempo histórico. Justamente creo que esa idea como de urgencia o de contingencia nos puede dictar qué usar estas herramientas artísticas al servicio de la emancipación y no tanto de reforzar pues hegemonías como todas las que ya mencioné.
Gracias, Mónica. Yo también te quiero responder, pero no voy a abusar de mi papel de...
Well, I'm not going to abuse my role of moderator. I will answer your question during the lunchtime. Any other question? Well, I wanted to make a comment. I'm Hortensia Verano, doctor in art science and full professor of the Arts University of Cuba in the Visual Arts School. And one of our main concerns regarding rethinking and reformulating is the professional training of the artist. What is the aim of the professional training of the artist? We have a very special basis different to other experiences in the Latin American region. And it is that as in the case of Cuba, education is not only a right, it's a duty, because it's a country that has no other wealth. So we have to bet on training their people to be able to resist. So with this basis, one of the main goals of our program is democratization of education, culture, art, and we are very much involved in that project because we are talking about the professional training of an artist. We have some limitations in terms of artistic education and our artistic training, developing audiences for art and art as a tool for educating people, for educating the common citizen, and also increase the artistic professional training. We have 3 levels: higher education, middle education, and primary education. In our case, we have postgraduate students. In our case of visual arts school, we receive postgraduate students who are already artists, who are professional artists. And that is an advantage because they dominate the profession, the trade, they know what their creative projects are. And of course, as I always say to my students, you are not here to become an artist, you are here to become a postgraduate or a graduate. And in line with the topic of the panel, in our experience, I'm a professor of theory. Sometimes I feel that there is that praxis and theory are not very closely linked, and in a world where we talk about interdisciplinary system, sometimes we don't find the formulas to put all these theories into practice, theories that we repeat and repeat, but do not implement in training processes. And in this case, I wanted to talk about a recent experience, research project in a territory that we have developed since July in a town in the westernmost region of the island, a town that is totally invisible. It was a mining town, a very successful mining town. One day the mine was closed for different reasons, economic and technological reasons, and it became like a ghost town. I'm talking about Minas de Matahambre. So a team or a group of us went there for a field study, and we went there to learn. And I think the experience of these third-year art students and their living with the population there, learning from the people in the town, learning about different life stories, I think that was just what I needed for changing our way of thinking. We need to share knowledges, but I think that integration is lacking. The result of that experience was an exhibition entitled Mata Hambre at the Art University. By the way, I invite you to see the exhibition. Not only this one, but all the exhibitions that we have at the Art Visual School, but particularly this exhibition, which is the artistic result of that research that we carried out. And this the students generated their artistic proposals based on all this study and research. What can art do? What can artists do to contribute to transform the reality that we found in that town so that people recover their identity that they lost as a mining town? So we are thinking of going back in February. We are going to take the exhibition there, and people are very much excited about this. So we are mobilizing entities, institutions, the Ministry of Mines and Energy to continue or to start a project that is a very wide project. But going back to what I was saying, we have a theoretical event in our visual arts school. It will be next week in Pabellon Cuba, where I will be presenting the need of a qualitative change in terms of the educational or training strategy. My presentation is entitled the undisciplined training of the artist, and I think it's very much in line with what has been discussed here, and that is also a way of emancipating ourselves. Thank you. Thank you. Well, I want to take the opportunity to comment that we have organized a collaborative congress on Saturday to foster dialogue and exchange among all participants. It will be at 11 o'clock. We will start in the Café Baco at the Universal Hall. So please, we would like to know how many participants we will have. You can write to our Gmail. And there we will have the opportunity to expand this dialogue among all participants. We will have a shared final document in electronic format. You are welcome. Please attend this event. And I thank the lady for the experience she has commented. Are there any other questions or remarks?
Ay, pues con tu...
No, a colación con lo que ustedes.
In line with what you said, I want to clarify that the Art University of Cuba, there are a group of persons that we are having a PhD degree, and we will all be part of the Saturday event. We will be we will have a panel. Thank you very much for informing us. Well, is there any question? Anyway, we will continue in the afternoon and Saturday also, so we have time. So no more questions? Okay, if there are no questions, We will start at 2:30, and then we will have a final debate with the members of this panel and of the next panel. Thank you, and let's be back at 2:30 sharp. Thank you.
Uno habla desde la educación, desde el museo y el otro ya. Sí, a mí también me gustó mucho, espero que hayan entendido. Ya lo tenemos introyectado. Ya.
Es medio, es medio informal el bueno.
Pero ya sabías, ¿no? Entonces,
Oye,
ya sabías, no tienes que
oye, pero tú eres medio no formal, ¿no? Eres medio no formal. Eres nuestra